Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's installment of the Edison Research Lunchtime Webinar Series, Podcasting, Connection and Community During Quarantine. We're going to get started, and I will hand it over to Edison Research Senior VP, Tom Webster.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this. There's so many of you on here, and I know so much of our lives is being led on Zoom these days, or whatever the webinar platform of your choice is. So thanks for hanging out and checking out another one with us. We've got some really great data today. We have some qualitative data that I'm going to show you, some great videos that we captured of how people's podcasting habits have changed in quarantine. But we've also got some new quantitative data from our ongoing podcast consumer tracking report with some really hard information on how the reach of podcasting and people's habits have changed as a result of the quarantine due to COVID-19. And as I mentioned earlier, we have some great qualitative video that I want to show you. And part of that, I think, really demonstrates the connection that people have with podcasting. Years ago, people would refer to radio as a companion medium because it could accompany you and sort of keep you company with whatever you're doing in your work life or your home life. And I think for the more than 100 million Americans who listen to a podcast at least monthly, podcasts have really replaced that form of connection for them. And you really get a sense of that from the people that we talk to. So to go all meta on you, here's a Zoom within a Zoom.
Now that everybody else is home, you can always hear somebody mowing their lawn, hammering something, the dog is barking, things like that. But if I need to be focused on homework or anything else that I'm doing, I put these headphones on and listen to whatever, and it helps me focus, helps me drown out the background noise.
The thing for me is it allows me to have a conversation, kind of what I mentioned earlier, a conversation that that isn't accessible on a daily basis. My wife and I, we have a lot of the same interests, but there are a lot of interests that we don't, really, enjoy together. And I enjoy civil engagement. I like to understand what's going on.
I mean, it's nice to just hear other humans talk, I guess. That's definitely a good thing. And I guess it's also nice, like with some media that was either recorded before this or just already exists. Everything's all normal in those, like, because they were either done before or they just acknowledged that or it's in a fictional world where they're not acknowledging that. So it's kind of cool to hear people talk about stuff that's happening that I am also experiencing, even though they don't know who I am or anything like that. It's, I've spent hours and hours listening to these people. So, you sort of start to feel like you know them.
I love the podcast because it takes me to a different place. And just for that short amount of time, I'm not thinking about all the other things that are going on here. And it also gives me sort of peace of mind in terms of, I have some time to set aside for myself, and I can take a half hour to listen to a podcast. I can't be gone for 3 days, but I can listen to a podcast for 30 minutes, and sometimes as a mom with kids, like that's exactly what you need just to, again, like break up the monotony of the day, or just to, even sometimes if you're upset about something, just to kind of cool down and relax, refresh. Then you get back to what it is you have to do. I definitely couldn't listen to them all day long for a variety of reasons. But I enjoy the time that I'm able to take to listen to them.
So I think you can definitely see that we're all going through this shared experience together. And it's clear that podcasts are part of the connective tissue. And there are obviously many things that we're sharing throughout this experience, but podcasts are at least part of that connective tissue between we humans who have been in quarantine now for so many weeks. So I'd love to show you now some data from a study that is subscription only, but we added some questions in here specific to the period of time that we're going through right now. And that's our podcast consumer tracker. And for those of you that are not familiar with the podcast consumer tracker, this is an ongoing survey of weekly podcast consumers. And we sample every single day. And when we started this last July, We've now put out 3 quarterly reports. We're halfway through the second quarter of this year, and I've got some partial data to show you from this quarter. But what I'll show you is, as a result of all of this, is from more than 7,000 interviews that we've done consistently every day since last summer of weekly podcast consumers. And the methodology that we use here, amongst all of the other questions that we ask them, is we ask them to go to their podcast clients, players of choice, and write down the podcast that they listen to in the survey week, the week before the interview. And then we hand code all of that. And as you can imagine, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasts so that we can get a sense of the entire market. This is the only survey that measures the entire market, and it measures it from the listener's perspective. So, there's certainly download rankers and charts out there that don't have universal participation, but we're measuring everybody in this because we're doing this from the listener's perspective. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how weekly podcast consumers and their work lives have changed. And as it turns out, there have been some pretty significant changes. And again, the base here, weekly podcast listeners. And this is for this partial quarter, Q2, which is about 1,000 people in this sample from the beginning of April 1st until May 12th is when we cut this off. And so for those people, for those 1,000 weekly podcast consumers, 32% say that their work hours have either been reduced or postponed, and another 9% say they've been eliminated entirely. That's 41% of weekly podcast consumers who have had some kind of disruption, either a reduction or an elimination of their work hours and of their jobs. So there's no question that amongst the people who are the best customers of podcasting, they've had a pretty significant disruption in their lives. We asked them currently, where is your work done? And again, this is all data collected during the quarantine. And of the 69% of weekly podcast listeners who are employed at least part-time, nearly 2/3 say they now mostly work from home. 64% say they mostly work from home, and another 8% say they work from home and a place of employment about equally. So add those two together, 72% of weekly podcast consumers who are employed at least part-time are doing at least some, if not most, of their work at home. And again, that has a significant effect on media consumption habits, media consumption patterns. And I'll get to that specifically for podcasting in a moment. We also asked people who now are working from home, those weekly podcast listeners who currently work from home, since the outbreak of COVID-19, would you say you've been working from home more, less, or about the same? And again, 64% say that they are working home. That's people who used to work at least a little bit at home. And now, of course, many of us are working more at home. And another 16% say they're working more from home who did not work from home previously. So again, a very significant disruption to our patterns. And that also impacts how we consume media and how we listen to podcasts. And that impact has not been sort of uniformly distributed. This is the age composition of weekly podcast listeners in total. 44% of weekly podcast listeners are 18 to 34, 39% are 35 to 54, and 17% are 55 plus. Now I'm going to overlay the percentage of respondents who have had their work eliminated or reduced, and those who are newly working from home. They're working from home now, but they didn't before. And you can see when you look at the composition of weekly podcast listeners who have had their work eliminated or reduced, that blue bar in the middle, it's even more strongly 18 to 34 than 35 to 54 or 55 plus. And when you look at those who are newly working from home, again, there's an increase there, 18 to 34, and a decrease, and really a sharp decrease, 55 plus. So while quarantine is affecting all of us, at least in terms of weekly podcast listeners, those who are age 18 to 34 are actually being a little more strongly impacted in terms of a disruption of their work life. We ask a number of lifestyle questions in the podcast consumer tracker, and I'll get to some of the categories that we typically ask at the end. But we added a few new ones, again, during this time of quarantine to find out how some rather unique habits have either become newly adopted or have changed. And first amongst these, well, you're soaking in it. Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, all of these things. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, Have you used video call services such as Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, etc. for personal connection? More or less are about the same. And this is amongst the 83% of us who ever do this. So 17% of weekly podcast listeners don't ever do this. But amongst those who do use these services for personal connection, 2/3 say they're using these services more, 67%. And another 6% only started using these services as a result of COVID-19 precautions. So again, pretty significant behavior change. We've certainly read a lot about the changes and kind of growing pains with Zoom and some other platforms as they become acclimated to the sheer number, millions of us who are now using these things to keep in touch with people in our everyday lives. Now, this is just for a personal connection. People are also using these platforms, as I am and as I suspect all of you are, for work. And amongst weekly podcast listeners who are employed, at least part-time, who use these services for work, and that's a little more than half, as you can see in the subheading here, 66% of those people say they're using these video call services more for work than they used to. And another 9%, again, only started using these services as a result of COVID-19 precautions. So 75% essentially using them more than they used to, whether they used to use them before or not, because this is essentially the interface to our everyday lives. And I have to think for millions of podcast listeners, it's kind of nice to just close your eyes, because I don't know about you, but I have incredible Zoom fatigue. I signed up for masterclass at the start of all this, and I've learned absolutely nothing. And many of you may be in the same boat. And some of that, I think, is screen fatigue. So again, thank you for spending your lunch hour with me. But podcasts and audio, I think, are a welcome relief from some of this Zoom fatigue. Another thing that we're doing more as a result of quarantine, amongst weekly podcast listeners who ever use delivery or takeout services like Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub, etc., 38% are using them more, 37% the same amount, and 5% only recently started adopting these services as a result of quarantine. Just 20% say that they're using them less, and that may be work-related, because certainly those entities have tremendous penetration in offices, especially in urban areas. So 38% of those who have been using these services before are now using them a lot more. I know we have Takeout Tuesday here in our household, and Takeout Blur's Day when we don't feel like cooking. So these services are certainly, again, taking on a lot more importance in the fabric of our society. And people are using them more often. We asked people how often they're using on-demand companies that can immediately deliver goods or provide services, things like Uber, Instacart, even Airbnb, things to deliver food, things to deliver services. And the percentage of people who say they use these services at least weekly has doubled in the period of time from the first quarter in 2020 in our podcast consumer tracker data to the period of time from April 1st through May 12th. So just in that short period of time from last quarter to this quarter, and again, even though we have a partial quarter here for Q2, it's a significant sample. These services are being adopted much more frequently by weekly podcast consumers who are using their apps and using their phones considerably. Now, all of this, as I mentioned, has an impact on how we consume media, what we're listening to, what we're watching. And when this all started, I remember being asked by a number of journalists if I thought podcast listening was going to ramp up dramatically because we would all be home. And I cautioned against that because what we've seen from previous significant disruptions in American life, in society, significant impacts, major storms, is that the media landscape is something of a snow globe. And when it gets disrupted, it gets shaken up and the flakes inside fall in sort of different patterns. And they may never go back exactly the way that they went again, but eventually they do settle. And certainly what we saw through the course of daily tracking of podcast consumers, which we do in the podcast consumer tracker, is at the very beginning, we saw some significant disruptions, both in terms of the number of hours people were listening to and also the genres and topics of podcasts that they wanted to hear. But as this period of quarantine has gone on, things are starting to settle back not completely back the way they were, and I don't think that will ever happen, but certainly into patterns that were more closely approaching where they were, let's say in February, than where they were at the very end of March or the very beginning of April. We asked people what they listened to in the last week, and I'll show you just 4 of the things that we asked here. Podcasts, I'll remind you, you have to be a podcast listener at least weekly to get into this sample, but I put it there for completeness sake. AM/FM radio does show a fairly significant decline amongst weekly podcast consumers. In the period of time in the first quarter, 61% said that they listened to AM/FM radio. And in the period of time from April 1st to May 12th, that drops to 50% of weekly podcast consumers who say that they have listened to AM/FM radio in the last week. There's a smaller drop for internet-only radio, not as significant as AM/FM radio. And by internet-only, we mean the pure plays like Spotify, Pandora, etc. And then audiobooks kind of hung in there about the same. So really the most significant shift that we see here in terms of the types of media listened to, at least amongst weekly podcast consumers, is a bit of a decline in AM/FM radio. And we also see a little bit of a shift in how podcasts are listened to. Smartphones certainly remains the dominant modality to listen to podcasts. But now that we're home, so many of us are in front of our desktop computers or our laptop computers, and that has shot up. And one thing I will tell you about podcast consumer tracker data with its significantly large sample size is that it's pretty stable. So things don't wobble quarter to quarter much. So the fact that computer went from 61 to 68 is actually a noticeable jump and worth remarking on here in this presentation. So more people at home, more people in front of their desktops and laptops has changed a little bit how we actually listen to podcasts. And we are still listening to podcasts, you'll be happy to know. I mentioned before that in the early days of quarantine, things did get disrupted quite a bit, but things have started to go back. And indeed, as the weeks of the quarantine period have gone on, here in Boston where I am, we're pretty much in week 10, things are starting to approach where they were, at least in terms of where we expect them to be in the amount of consumption and the types of content consumed and so on. And I mentioned that snow globe analogy. We're going to show you now some podcast listeners and how the quarantine has affected how much content that they listen to. Because I think what you're going to see here, regardless of how many hours per week that we report in terms of changes between pre-quarantine and mid-quarantine, within that number and within those numbers that I'll show you, there's significant churn. There are people who used to listen to podcasts all the time on their commute who aren't able to listen to them now because they have children at home. There are people who listened for 5 or 10 hours a week that are now listening to much, much more than that. And indeed, we saw some pretty significant outliers in that category in the partial data for the second quarter of this year. So there are actually big changes in here and a lot of churn, but it's all kind of evening out in terms of the overall reach of podcasts that we track. And I think you may have seen it in the various reported numbers from the various download charts that you've seen. So let's have a listen here to some podcast listeners and how their consumption habits have changed.
My consumption has definitely reduced now that I'm home. I've been a lot more social. Not that I wasn't before, but now that I'm sitting home and not in school, I would rather be talking to anybody in the house or anything like that, whereas at this time last year when I was in school, at this time right now, I would be sitting in the library listening to something, doing my schoolwork.
Definitely my listening has went down because I don't have that 40-minute commute. And, I do miss it. I feel like I don't get as much of the information. I'm not as informed as I was in the past. So now I get up and I listen to it in the bathroom and in the shower, both, usually news, something. Luckily, phones are waterproof because it has dropped a couple of times on me.
So I work in an open office with other people, and I'm often on the phone. And so to wear headphones, I have to take them in and out in order to play something over the headphones. So then it becomes more cumbersome and I don't do it as often at work. But here I can just play it over just a Bluetooth speaker, and there's not someone else that I would be bothering with noise. I probably would spend 5 to 10 hours a week initially, and now I probably listen to them 30 hours a week now.
So what it would normally be would be I would go to work for 8 hours, Monday through Friday, and then I would come home and do some art with my boyfriend, and we'd just sort of collectively listen to a podcast. It's obviously more now since neither of us had anything else to do.
Like I said, between the 3 kids, there's so many activities that we're doing all the time. I mean, I'm like the Uber driver, the unpaid Uber driver. All I do is drive them here, there, and everywhere, which is why, like I was saying before, I would listen to them in the car, you know? So I mean, I would listen to them just in a different way. Now I listen to them in a room alone. Before I listened to them alone, but in the car as I'm taking them somewhere. Now also it's sort of an escape, you know, because your own time by yourself. To me, those couple of minutes or that half an hour is, you know, just a nice reset.
So you really see the gamut there in terms of how everybody's habits have changed one way or the other. And ultimately, a lot of those changes really kind of canceled each other out. You'll see very few differences here between the frequency of consumption that we recorded in the first quarter of 2020 and what we've recorded from April 1st to May 12th. In fact, there's maybe a tiny increase here in those who say less than 3 hours. But as I mentioned before, on the right, in that 10 hours or more, there are some real outliers there in terms of the number of hours of podcasts consumed. You saw one young woman in the video go from 10 to about 30 in a week, and we did see some of that. So as a result of all of that, the time that we spend listening to podcasts in the first quarter compared to the time we're spending now in the current period of quarantine, it's about the same. In fact, now it's even gone up a skosh. It was 6.25 hours in the first quarter of our tracker data. Now it's 6 hours and 23 minutes. And again, there's a lot of churn. There are a lot of changing habits sort of disguised underneath that number. But in the wash, it's all kind of ended up about where it was. Now, there is an exception to that, and that is when you look at the podcast consumption habits of those who have had their jobs eliminated or reduced, and also those that are newly working from home. They were not working from home before. Now, if you just keep this number of 6 hours and 23 minutes in the back of your mind, that's the total listening by weekly podcast listeners in this partial second quarter. When we look at this by those who have had their jobs eliminated or reduced, it goes up. It goes up about 1/4 hour per week. But look at those who are newly working from home. It goes down by an hour. That is a significant drop. So yes, even though there are more of us at home that have more time to listen to podcasts, those of us that are new to picking up the habit of working from home, perhaps even homeschooling children, there's not as much time as there was. So those two numbers kind of cancel each other out a little bit and leave us with a number and amount of listening for weekly podcast consumers. That's about where it was before quarantine levels. But the patterns within those hours have changed pretty remarkably. And certainly one of the largest changes that we've observed are changes to content preferences and the types of content that people listen to. And we've been looking at this again daily, weekly, as the tracker rolls through collecting data from people living through this. And at the very beginning of the quarantine period, we saw some sharper differences, but those have begun to even out. You know, at the very beginning of the quarantine period, for example, we saw things like a pretty decent drop in sports, but thanks to the NFL draft and the Last Dance and a whole bunch of new content, that's coming back a little bit. And some of those differences, again, are not quite as exaggerated as they were at the very beginning of this period. And I'm going to show you in detail what I'm talking about. But I've got one more video to show you. And that's how the podcast listeners that we talk to, how their brains are working a little bit differently, as we all have COVID brain, in terms of the types of content they want to hear and how that's changed a little bit through the period of quarantine.
The first week or so, a lot of sports broadcasters didn't know what they were going to do, and they were kind of trying to grapple with how do we talk about sports when there's no sports, and they struggled for a minute, but I feel like they've all kind of got their home studios back. They're getting into a rhythm.
I feel like it's like bled into all of my podcasts, even the true crime ones. There was one I listened to last week that was saying that they took it was more than an hour, and it was talking about COVID related crimes. And I was like, how is this like possible that they have that much content over? I mean, people are supposed to be stuck in their homes, right? But it was really interesting. And they were talking about all these things that have happened.
I don't know. I feel like with the news and everything else that we're getting, like I need a break. And I kind of don't want to hear about it because I'm hearing about it everywhere else. When there's so much craziness going around, it is like being able to listen and have like more calming things. I do listen to like some of the self motivation or whatever, like ones. I probably have listened to more of those where they're more calm and like more meditation like or whatever versus I don't want to be all hyped up, I guess.
I imagine a lot of what I'm going to look for, or I'd be interested in understanding, is how a lot of those changes are going to take effect in terms of re-engineering humans like us, how we're going to essentially adapt and assimilate to this new environment.
I would say if there's any shift content-wise in what I'm looking for, it's more about the duration of the podcast rather than the content. I still like the same stuff. It's just that with everything that's going on now, I'm not as inclined to really get into listening to something for an hour to 2 hours.
So as we saw with the amount of time we're spending listening to podcasts, there's a lot of change underneath the surface. And some of those changes may be canceling each other out, but very few things are staying static. And this is the self-reported topics and genres listened to by weekly podcast consumers, again, from looking at the first quarter of this year and the partial second quarter from April 1st to May 12th. And you can see things are not too far from where they were in the first quarter. If anything, news is, as you can see, news has gone up. It's 3 percentage points higher than it was in the first quarter. At the very beginning of quarantine, that figure was exaggerated even a little bit more. Same with sports. While there was a slightly greater decline in terms of reach at the very beginning of the quarantine period, that's mitigated somewhat. It's now down by 2 percentage points. And if you look at all of these, really, news and information sticks out on this page. Wellness and self-improvement went up a little bit as we all, I think, try to work on ourselves. And I'll show you the second page here. There's a couple more that changed, at least from a percentage point standpoint, fairly significantly. And those are those 2 +3s at the bottom. I know 3 looks like a small number, but we're talking about, for language, going from 5% to 8%. That's a significant percentage jump, even as it is a 3 percentage point jump. So a lot of us, as you can see, wanted to work on ourselves, or work on our gardens, work on home improvement, learn a new language. So there certainly was that impetus for many of us as we got kind of settled into quarantine. And drama went up by 2 percentage points here as well, but not a tremendous number of changes now as the period of quarantine has gone on and into its 9th and 10th week, depending on where you live. We're starting to get back, I think, to where we were when all of this started. I've got one more new piece of data to show you. We've got a brand new top 10 ranker from the Podcast Consumer Tracker. We published one about a quarter ago. I've got a new ranker that I think has some new relevance. I just want to take a moment to point out that all of this data is from the Podcast Consumer Tracker, which is the only comprehensive, all-inclusive study of the entire podcast market. There's no opt-in. There's no people who decline to participate. This is the entire market from the listener's perspective, the podcasts that they listen to, the demographics of podcast listeners, their media consumption habits, their podcast listening habits, their attitudes about monetization and supporting podcasts, and attitudes about advertising. And we also have a pretty significant sales and targeting section here. In this particular quarter, we asked questions about social media, cell phones, alcohol and vehicles, or the drinking and driving tab, as I like to call it, shopping, dining, exercise, entertainment, work, and finance. And we also, of course, have a complete industry ranker of the leading networks in podcasting by reach. So what we report here are not downloads. We don't track that. We track the percentage of weekly podcast consumers who listen to all of the leading networks, and that's in a ranker that we update once a quarter. And the last new piece of data that I'll show you here, this is from the first quarter of 2020. These are the top 10 podcasts by reach. And again, reach is not downloads. Reach is the percentage of weekly podcast consumers who say they have listened to one of these shows in the last week. Number one by a lot, I will tell you, is the Joe Rogan Experience, which we know has now gone exclusive to Spotify. That's followed by The Daily, This American Life, Crime Junkie, and My Favorite Murder, somewhat concerning for all of us quarantined at home with our families. Stuff You Should Know, Office Ladies, and Wait, Don't Tell Me are kind of tied here in reach. Planet Money and Pod Save America, and that's your top 10 podcasts by penetration of the U.S. population of weekly podcast consumers. So a few observations here to wrap up. 41% of weekly podcast consumers have had their work reduced or eliminated. Make no mistake, all of us, no matter what economic strata we are in, have had some significant changes in our lives, particularly for those 18 to 34-year-olds. Now, while those who have had their jobs reduced or eliminated are listening more, those who are now newly working from home are actually spending a little bit less time with podcasts, about an hour per week, as home duties and work duties are all kind of taking place at the same time. We've seen some interesting changes in listening. Desktop, laptop listening has gone up. AM/FM listening has gone down, at least amongst weekly podcast consumers. Those weekly podcast consumers are using more delivery convenience services and also more video connection services. And finally, even though in the early days of the quarantine, we saw people fleeing away from news, fleeing towards news, maybe not having sports to talk about, those things are really starting to normalize. I want to let everybody know that the next in our Lunchtime Webinar Series is going to be on Thursday, June 4th. And that's going to be the Infinite Dial Canada, which I'll be delighted to be co-presenting with Stephanie Donovan from Triton Digital, our wonderful partners on the Infinite Dial. And so we'll be back here in 2 weeks to present that. Let's see. I had a question. Any comments on the Joe Rogan Spotify deal? Yes, it's good to be Joe Rogan, would be my comment there. And let's see. I'm going to look at a couple more questions. When the lockdown gets lifted, what do you think will happen with production backlogs? What implication for new projects? Well, that's going to affect everything. And I think, if anything, it's a good time to have evergreen content and stuff in the archives and ways to kind of cross-promote that. But the one thing about podcasting, maybe not so much for super high production intensive podcasts, although anything is possible, it's certainly going to affect podcasting far less than it's going to affect television and movies. So I think, if anything, podcasting will be a little bit more immune to that. Here's another question. I'd like to ask if they tested the assumption that the drop-off in AM/FM radio listening is due to no car commutes. I don't know that we tested that assumption in quite the way that you mean, but that's certainly the most logical way to think of it. All right. I think that's going to wrap things up. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar, and I hope you'll be with us in 2 weeks when we present Infinite Dial Canada. This particular webinar was a lot of work, and a lot of people worked really, really hard right up until the finish line. And so I, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Team Edison, for making this happen. And thanks to all of you for the gift of your time and attention. Take care.